So if anyone has any questions throughout the presentation, by all means, feel free to speak up. Don't hesitate or feel like you have to wait at all. And I see, so, and as you have likely seen, so we are recording this. So if anybody has any questions or on that, please let us know. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank
So
you.
Thais, who is, I think you all know, is the gender advisor for ILRG on a global scale, and so she will take it from here.
I'm gonna put my camera on just to say hi for those that I haven't met before, but I'm gonna turn my camera off so it doesn't take the connection. So I'm gonna share my screen. There you go. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
So as Megan mentioned, this is the first training for ILRG, and we're starting talking about something that is very important to our work, informed consent for photos and videos. And throughout the presentation, when I talk about photos, just bear in mind that I'm also referring to videos in the same way. I just didn't want to write photos and videos in everything because it would be too long. But everything that applies to photos, of course, applies to videos as well. And I want this to be a conversation. So if at any point you have comments or questions, please feel free to jump in. We have a policy that I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with that has been shared. But the idea is after this training, based on what we talked today, we can also make necessary amends to the policy because our goal is to always improve it and also to have something that is usable for everybody, for our teams, our staff, our consultants, our partners. So let's also keep that in mind. So I just want to give a little introduction of why we use photography in international development and what are the main challenges and debates that we have around. So on the positive side, we use photos to share our impact because that also gets further buying and support and funds as well for the work that we do. It also enables participants that sometimes wouldn't otherwise have that access to some space of visibility where they can show their needs, their accomplishments. So it provides a space for them as well. And also is a way, a tool to respond to disempowering and dehumanizing narratives and images that we can see around international development. Recently has changed a bit, but it's still, and here's the downside, there is a history of dehumanizing representations of global poverty and people in developing countries. On the negative side as well, there is also a power imbalance in international development, and this is inevitable. So there is an imbalance between developed countries and developing countries, between home staff, about the field staff, and the field staff with the beneficiaries as well. There is always the inevitable power relationship that we have to keep in mind that also influence how photography is taken, used, and how it influences consent as well, that we'll be talking a bit. There's also a digital gap. So as photos are used more and more online and not in printed materials, not everybody has the same access to the internet and to seeing these photos in the same way, social media, websites. So this is also important. And also images, once they are online on the internet, they will live there forever. And once they are online, we have very limited control how it's used, if there is misuse, manipulation, reproduction. So those are all things that are important, the use of photography. But then if those are the reasons that we take photography and those are the risks as a whole for the sector, what are the motivations and the risks for the participants, for the people that we're taking photos of? In terms of motivations, people want to raise, one of the motivations, it could be that they want to raise awareness about a certain issue, about their condition, and to help others. There's also could be a desire, again, to have a voice and to be heard by others. There could be a belief that it could lead to some immediate assistance, and we're going to be talking about that, how to manage those expectations. And also there is a relationship of trust with ILRG and partners. So people feel compelled to keep engaged with the project and with the staff, and they are okay to have their photos taken. But there are also negative sides and risks for the participants on having their image taken and used by the project. First of all, the participants have very limited control over how far their image can travel locally and globally, and how that image will be interpreted and viewed by others. There's also a risk of overusing an image. I think there was a case in a humanitarian crisis that a photo of a girl was used over and over in materials related to that crisis, and she became quickly, quote unquote, the face of that humanitarian crisis. And as she grew from a child to a young woman, she felt really upset about having her face overused like that. There's also a risk of violence by family members and community members, and there could be several motivations. It could be a bit of jealousy because that person was portrayed in a document or in a material. It could also be shame, or people can be upset because a family member participated in that. There's also a person's shame from being associated with poverty and disempowerment. So, and this could lead to especially safety concerns for people that are particularly vulnerable, such as people that experience gender-based violence, people that have been forcibly displaced. So when we're asking people to take photos of them and to use their photos, we need to keep in mind this: what are their motivations and what are the risks, and we need to be very clear about them, about these potential risks, and try to minimize them. Again, any questions or any comments at any point, just interrupt me. If not, I will just keep going. uh ooh, I can pass it. Yeah. So one way that is very important to minimize those risks is using informed consent. But considering all the things that we discussed a while ago about the power imbalance, about the dehumanizing practice of use of photos in international development, some question if free and informed consent is even possible in international development. Is it really free? Can participants really say no to an NGO staff or international project staff asking to take the pictures if there is that power relationship? Can they really say no? Do they feel that they can say no? And is it really informed? Because often when we take photos of field visits or field activities, we don't even know if or how we're going to use those images exactly. It could be that something is produced afterwards. And also because the understanding of how internet and social media works, it's not universal. Participants might not necessarily be familiar with. Even if we inform, okay, we're going to be using this photo in a report or a blog post that we're going to be published on the internet. Does that really mean anything to some of the participants? But because of these limitations related to the power imbalance and imperfect knowledge, that doesn't mean that we can then assume that the participants are unable to consent or that we should not get their consent. Quite the contrary. As I said, informed consent can help minimize the risks for the participants and promote human dignity and the do no harm approach. So it is really important to promote people's agency and the rights over their own image. I'm not sure this is the case with the participants that we work with at ILRG, but in my past, I have worked, when I work in the actual field, I work in humanitarian response with refugees. So I have seen a lot in my career before this, people that have lost, quote unquote, everything of material value and also intangible things, family, being able to make decisions about their lives, where they live, when they're going to eat, what they can do. So I think having control over their own image is one of the last things that they can have control of. And I think it's very important not to take that away. So here I just share a survey by Save the Children, and Save the Children is one of the organizations that has been quite reflecting about this use of images. They have found that people that are photographed, they feel that their dignity is upheld when they have a choice if and how they're going to be represented, and they clearly understand the purpose and the added value of sharing their image and their story. So I think this is important for us to keep in mind as well. So with that, we develop a policy for the ethical use of visual and written content, and it's also about stories and quotes that we take from beneficiaries to use in our communications materials. And the purpose of the policy is to make sure that we collect and use photos, videos, quotes, stories in an ethical manner that portrays the people that we work with respect, dignity, and accuracy, but also that complies with our contract obligations. We are a USA contractor, so we have to keep those obligations in mind, of course, and also protect Tetra Tech's and USA brands, and of course the brand of the partners that we work with as well. The policy applies to all ILRG staff, to consultants, to contractors, to grantees, our implementing partners. So everybody has to be familiar with the policy and apply it. And it's based on certain principles such as do no harm and the duty of care that we have with our participants, transparency and accountability, and we're going to talk about accountability a bit later, respect for the dignity, and as I said, the right to privacy and control of image that people have, no matter who. It's also representation of the work that we do in a way that is context appropriate, that is accurate, and that is humanizing. And this all is based on free, prior, informed, and meaningful consent. And we're going to talk about what that means. So what do we mean about free, informed, and meaningful consent? So when we approach somebody in a field activity, an event, a training, a regular field visit, and we're gonna take photos, and we should take photos because, as I said, we want to be able to communicate our work and to get buy-in, to get interest, and to get funds for the work we do. We need to explain why the photos are being taken and if the photos can be taken. And there are a few key information to be provided, so it is truly informed consent. So where and how the photos will or could be used. So if we don't know exactly, we don't have a report or a blog post or an interview, a media article in mind, some examples of how it could be used and over what period of time. So we are talking in the policy for 5 years, although we have to remind people again that once things are on the internet, they live there forever. Emphasize and this is something that we can discuss as a group, the restriction to 5 years can be hard because once photos are shared with USA through the land flicker, we lose a bit of control of how long they're going to be used for. But we need to remind participants that we are making a conscious effort to retire photos after 5 years. We need to remind people of the voluntary participation of having their photos taken so people can and should feel able to say no. And this is important with the last point to emphasize again the expectations that there are no gains, there is no immediate material gain to having their photo taken, but also there is no loss. So somebody that says, no, I don't feel comfortable, I don't want my photo taken, that doesn't mean anything in their engagement with ILRG or with the activity, if it's a training, again, or any other activity. Also explain the right to be forgotten. So it could be that somebody during an event, or if we do a quick interview with somebody, they say, yes, you can take my words, you can take my photo, I'm fine with it, I consent. And then afterwards they go home, they talk to their family, they further reflect on it because sometimes it's quite hard to reflect on the spot. They think about it and they decide that they're not comfortable with, so they have a right to then to be forgotten to contact ILRG next time they interact with ILRG and say, I really don't want my image or my words to be used. So to give people that opportunity, but also it's important to explain the limitations that if that change of mind happens after the image has already been used or published somewhere, it cannot be taken back. Or even if we can take the document off online, it likely has been reproduced or saved by other people, so we cannot completely remove something. Again, as we talk in the first two slides, the risks for participants to go through the potential risks of retribution, retaliation, or feeling shame or stigma. So go through those risks, the lack of control of how things are used or misused on the internet, and the potential consequence. So people are really aware of those when they give their consent. And also, again, the no risks, no gains or losses immediately related to participating or not. And here are just a few tips. They are a bit more detailed in the policy, and the policy is very short. It's 3 pages because we wanted to keep as uncomplicated as possible. But here are some tips. Try to avoid using blanket statements such, we will use your image as we see fit. A lot of the very legalist, jargony consent forms use that. We will use your image as we see fit because people cannot envision how that actually will happen in reality. So also help people see how their images will or could be used. So if we say we could use this in a social media post, try to have your phone and then show what a social media post looks like and what are the reach, how many likes or views it could get, so people know that it's something that could be seen by a lot of people, and show how the internet works. If it's going to be in a printed material, try to have examples of previous materials and how they were used so people can really understand. And that's why we're talking about the meaningful consent. If people understand exactly what we're talking about, it's more likely that that consent is meaningful. And also make it a two-way communication so people can ask questions and really go into detail how it would be used. So here is part, I put here some screenshots of the written and the verbal consent that we have in the policy. Again, the goal is to keep extremely simple, both for staff. We don't want this to be burdensome on staff and our contractors and subcontractors and grantees and local implementing partners, but also we don't want it to be burdensome for the people that we work with, for the participants. So if you see, the language is very simple and it's very brief. And we're going to go over when we need written consent and verbal consent. And if we are doing verbal consent, here's just a checklist of what we need to have told people before assuming that they gave their verbal consent. So when taking verbal consent, it's also very important to record the name of people who appear in close-up images, because this will help if we use that image to link the person to the image. And if written consent is not possible because there are literacy barriers or cultural barriers, it's not well seen to be people going to be uncomfortable signing a paper, or they are unable to sign a paper, verbal consent in a recorded manner can be used. And it could be either recording audio, or it could be a written confirmation by the staff. So the staff can just send an email, yes, I spoke to so and so, explain everything, and he or she, they understood and they gave their verbal consent. And here we have a quick guide to informed consent. So when consent is not needed, when do we use verbal consent, and when do we need written consent? So when consent is not needed, of course, if we're photographing public figures, a chief or an authority in a public space, when we are with large crowds in public events. One example, I'm going to show some photos in a bit. Uh, Sorry, I cannot see the chat. So Matt, Megan, please, if there is anything on the chat, please let me know, because I'm sharing my screen. I can't see. So for instance, we're going to share photos from the recent elections that we participate promoting women's inclusion in Zambia. So there were big public events with people lining up to vote. So of course, we're not going to get consent of everybody in the lines that we're photographing. Individuals who are in the background or in events and that we cannot recognize, we do not need to get their consent. For verbal consent, when we are doing general project activities, general field visits, like in India, visiting the farming communities, or events, training. So that verbal consent, I'm going to explain, just tell people at the beginning or when you start the interaction, as we were going through this visit, this training, we're going to be taking photos of the group, and again, explain how it could be used, etc., everything that we went through before. And then ask people, are you okay if we take your photo? And then people can give their verbal consent, and that's enough. Uh, and this is also important if we are taking, for instance, in a field visit with the farmers in India, again, one example, we are not thinking of a specific publication that we want to use those photos for. We don't have a specific blog post or article for the media report that we want to use, but we might use in the future. So we don't need to get specific written consent for that because we're not necessarily using the photos. But if we're taking or interviewing somebody or taking specific close-up photos of people to use in a specific report, a blog, and we're interviewing that person and getting their words and their story, for instance, we did that with some of the community agronomists, then we need written consent because that image will for sure be used, those words will for sure be used, and it's very important to explain that and get the written consent. And also get written consent when we're intentionally and only interviewing or photographing particularly vulnerable groups. So if we're writing a report or a document about people experience gender-based violence and we're interviewing them, so those are particularly vulnerable people, we need to get a written consent and be extremely careful in explaining the risks and the and concerns. Same for forcibly displaced people and other vulnerable groups that we might have identified in the course of our work. Any questions so far? If not, I have here some examples of this.
Thais, I might just note, I think that it's assumed the consent's not needed when it's coming from a picture of a partner or a staff member or a member of our team would probably also be, I would think. I don't know if that's correct too.
If the
It's sort
staff
of
member will
implied
be in the
within.
photos as well?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, I guess, generally implied, I
Yeah,
would think, by
but I
a
think
working
the
person.
staff is important to talk to staff that they also have then the right to opt out to say, I don't feel comfortable to be in the picture. So can we try to take pictures that I'm not in
Yeah.
the frame? I
Yeah.
think it
That's
is
fine.
implied, but then there is a right to opt out.
Okay. Thank you.
So here's some examples. So written consent. So these are situations that we need to obtain written consent. So those are photos that the middle one that we use specific for a report. The second one is a close-up that we wanted to use again for a document. And the first one as well in Zambia. So these are showing close-up of people we have in mind that we're going to use in a upcoming report or blog post, etc. So this we need to have written consent, and these people are clearly identifiable. And we also interview them, so we also got their words and their stories and quotes to use. So these are cases that we need to obtain written consent. Verbal consent. So here are some examples. So those are field activities. The first one was some focus group for a gender assessment. The second one was also focus group with mapping for a gender assessment. The third was a training in India. So the first one is in Ghana, the second in Mozambique, the third in India, the fourth also in fifth in India, and the final one is a training in Zambia. So those are the situations that I said before as we visit and talk to people as we go in the field visit, in the training, to explain to the whole group that we are going to be taking photos. And if people explain why the photos, that people can also opt out and say like, I really don't want to be in any photos. But it's a general blanket consent from the whole group and people can opt out. So of course, we're not going to go through and ask each of these people to record a verbal consent or to sign a written consent, because that would make life really impossible. But explain before and getting that verbal agreement from the whole group is very important. And here's an example. I think in the fourth photo, we can see that Matthew have circled the person in the background in red. So we don't need like a necessarily the consent. Like if we were to use that photo of the person in the forefront, we would then have to go back and get a written consent, but we don't need for the person in the background. So I think, is it clear, like this type of situations, training, gender assessment, or group gatherings, that we explain to the whole group what's the purpose of taking photos, what's the risk, and we have the checklist to go through, and then people can opt out if they want. So it's not an opt-in. The written consent people expressly opt in, but the verbal consent people can opt out. And here finally are some examples that we do not need consent. So the first one was the CEO of PepsiCo in India in an event. So we don't need, is a public event, signing an agreement. So we don't need consent, of course, from the people in the photo. The second one also was a public event. Of course, we won't need consent from people. The final one was also a public event. And the two in the bottom left are the event that I was mentioning, the elections in Zambia for community resource boards. So people are lining up to vote. It's a public gathering that it was not initiated or controlled by ILRG. So of course we don't need to get consent from all those people showing in the photos. So after obtaining consent, so we went through the process to obtain consent, what we need to inform people, when do we need consent, and which type of consent, written, verbal, the forms available in the policy, they are very simplified. So what do we do after obtaining consent, after taking the photos? And this is what we're talking about in the beginning, accountability. And this is a crucial part of truly meaningful consent and having a respectful relationship with the people we work with. So once we have used participants' image in a public information material that really display them, a blog post, a media article, a printed leaflet, a report, we should make a genuine effort to share back with them. And if only online is, if online access where the person lives is not possible, or the person does not have access, digital access, try to provide a printed version so they can see what it looks like. And if the participants cannot read, try to explain the content to them. And again, this interaction to share back how the image was used is an important part to explain the reach of the content. And I should have included here, we have a photo of recently Shubrata shared back a media article with the woman whose photo was used. So there was the photo was published in a newspaper in India. So the India team took back and showed the participants what it looked like, and they discussed it. And I think Subrata, if you want to talk about that experience, would be great. Not to put you on the spot if you feel comfortable with.
No,
And
no, yeah, thanks, Thais. No, that helps us in another way also. That woman was very proud and everybody, but others were also feeling encouraged because that was a Muslim village, minority Muslim community. So they have some reservation initially also about taking photographs or using it for other purpose, mainly their male counterparts. But that photo has encouraged all the community members also. So when the video team has gone, everybody is very interested and keen to participate in that because they understood the reach of these. That's the best part of that photo also, and all members were sharing their thoughts and looking at those photo news.
great, thank you, Subrata.
Yeah.
So that part of the accountability is like to close the loop in how we want to do respectful, human, dignified work when we're taking photos. So people know, I was reading another report by Save the Children about this use of image, and it has lots of quotes from people talking about when their image is used. And one of the main things that people raise is that they came, they took our photos, they promised they would use in this way, and we've never heard anything back. We would love to see what happened and how did that go. So closing that loop is very important. Also, the record and storage, I think that was a common question when we first shared the policy. So country managers or country directors, they are responsible to store the digitalized signed consent forms and any records or verbal consent when written consent is not possible due to cultural or literacy barriers. So as applicable, they should store this for 5 years because that's the time that we're using say that we're using the photos. And they don't need to share with ILRG home office only upon request. If necessary, if you request it, they could share with the task leaders or the chief of party or the deputy chief of party. It's very important again to label the photos well so we can connect them to consent data. So a lot of times we have lots of photos with like close-ups of people that we don't know who is in that photo. So it will be really hard to then find the consent and verify that the photo has consent. And also dating photos. So we are able to retire photos that are within our control after 5 years. So here I just put some special situations that often have some questions for us to discuss. The first one again is group photos. So for posed photos, small groups like we have the one here on the left, get the verbal consent. Just again explain, we're going to take a photo of this group. We might use in public information materials. Is everybody okay with this? Again, explain everything that we discussed before taking that group photo. If ILRG is organizing an event or a training, as I said, provide information to the whole group at the beginning, including the option to opt out, and that is considered as agreement. And also bear in mind the power dynamics. So it could be that if we're talking or photographing a whole group or a whole family, a person in a real or a perceived position of authority can give permission on behalf of the whole community. But it's important to see if you feel that is not the case or there some people are uncomfortable, then you can talk to people separately to reinforce that message. So it's very important to use good judgment in those situations. Another situation is vulnerable groups. So as we said, people that have experienced violence, forced displacement, and children. The first photo on the top is not from ILRG, and I put the credit there. It's from UN Women. It was a guide from UN Women on how options to photograph people that have experienced gender-based violence. So it's just an example of creative photograph that shows people from the back. You cannot identify that person. So for people that feel uncomfortable or people that are particularly vulnerable, offer that option to hide their identity using this type of created photography, or also using pseudonyms, or giving the option that we're not going to use their real name, that we will make the best efforts to not disclose their identity. But again, we need to inform people of the potential risks, and the full guarantee of anonymity is not necessarily possible, but we're going to make our best efforts. Also, in our policy, ILRG will not use photos or stories of children, and we define that as people under 18 years old. And the reason being because there are like many other implications, and it is not ILRG's main focus. It's not a program that is focused on children. So we're not going to use photos of close-up showing the face of children, but the children can be present in the background and if they're not identifiable. So here we put some examples of children that have their back to the camera, or in the example in the bottom right, the lady is wearing her child in her backs, but we cannot identify the children. So these photos could be okay. And that photo of the lady wearing the child, there was another child behind her, so I cropped that. So we could also crop that now to see the child. Other situations, of course, with the pandemic that we're all facing, please, it's very important to make sure that all the photos that we're taking show and follow all the precaution measures necessary. And of course, all the consent requirements still apply as in quote unquote normal times. So here we have a few examples of good photos that we have received. The first two are, again, the gender assessment in Ghana, so showing how the focus groups were carried out outside and using masks and sanitizing. The third one is a discussion in India in a space with good ventilation, windows open and distancing. The other one with the potatoes also from India. The women in the same group, they work together. They're all wearing masks. And the final one is from an event in Zambia with proper spacing, social distancing, and masks. So using photos. So we have talked about taking the photos, obtaining consent, what we do after the consent, how to store, which situations which type of consent do we need. But then it comes the time to use the photos, which was the initial goal, right? To use the photos to showcase our work and get support. So it is always better to have multiple options of photos so we can choose from. So whenever do a field visit, a training, to have a variety of photos in different angles, different people, it gives us those options that if we decide to use one, and if there is somebody in the frame that does not feel comfortable to using, or it's just not really a great photo, then we have options to choose from. The policy has an annex, Annex 3, that has some guidance on what we want to convey with the photos we use with ILRG and what types of photos to avoid. And of course, we need to use our best judgment when selecting photos to use in our communications products. Again, that portray people in an accurate manner, in a humane manner, dignified, respectful manner. Also, it's important to check the background for any compromising or unwanted message and situations. Sometimes we're focused on what is at the forefront of the photo and we forget to look what's in the background. Also, avoid reusing the same photo of the same person over and over for every communication product. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, that girl that then became, of course, a woman, and she was upset that she became the face of that humanitarian crisis because her photo was so overused by NGOs that it created a problem for her. So let's avoid using the same photo and the same person over and over. For using online and printed materials, only use the photos that we have written or verbal consent, especially those photos, like as I said, I give the examples, the ones that are close up and they were like, this person said this and that, and we're attaching that to the words. And also be very careful when sharing photos with others, sending links to our folder with photos or sharing photos with other partners, because this reduces the control that we have over who is using them, why, how often, and for how long. And with that, we open for questions and discussions. And as I said, we want the policy to be a live document, and we want to be something that is usable by the field staff and is not burdensome. We don't want the need for informed consent that we owe as a responsibility, as I said, to our contract and most important to the people we work with. We don't want that to be a deterrent that people then would stop taking pictures from field activities, because that is what actually shows our work, especially I think, and I speak for myself and maybe other colleagues that were not in the field or not in the field often. It's a very important way for us to understand the work and feel connected to the work. Matt, anything to add? Any questions? And if folks want to share from their experience, situations they have experienced in the field, difficulties that they have found in obtaining consent, or that was confusing to get consent, whether they should or not, please feel free to share.
I just thank you. I agree. It's definitely everyone is encouraged to take photos, use photos, recognize that um, you know, if you have a nicer camera or a nicer camera on your phone, that we, very well may love to use some of the photos, that you've taken. In some cases, particularly in Zambia, particularly on the land rights work, we actually do take photos of people as part of the documentation process. We take photos of their identifications and even of the individuals, and that's part of the process as well. And so I think there's also a little bit of difference between when it's being used for that sort of purpose and then these communications purposes. So yeah,
True,
very,
true.
very glad.
And the policy we have in the Annex 3 that shows the types of photos to use and to avoid, we talk about that when we're using photos that show land certificates that has people's name, location, everything. Try to do photos a bit distant, like I showed an example. Let me just share again, of a couple holding their land certificate. So it's far out, that is, you cannot read even if you zoom. But also we can, if we publish that, we can also blur, and then we can put in the caption that some parts of the photo were blurred for the purpose of protecting the privacy and of people. And talking about this blurring photos and manipulation, the annex also talks about that when we're using photos to avoid editing the photos. So to change colors or the tone of the photo or flipping images. And one of the guidance that I was reading from another organization, flipping can be quite problematic because it could create cultural problems where people should not hold certain things with a certain hand. Then it becomes, when you flip that, they were holding something with the right hand, it becomes the left hand. People should stand in a certain side of somebody, so it can create problems for the participants. A photo that initially was not problematic can become problematic if it's flipped.
Thais, I have a question. So I'm curious what your thoughts are in taking more like candid shots at first, and then, 'cause if anyone is like me, like I will take a lot of photos with my phone perhaps, and maybe there's two that I would actually like or share with anybody. And then, so if I take the shots and then look at them and find the ones that perhaps I will keep, then get permission after the fact or consent after the fact. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. If it's not, right in their face kind of photo.
Yeah, but I think in the beginning of the event where you were taking the photos, is important to then give that general
Absolutely.
explanation. We're
Absolutely,
going to be
yeah.
taking photos, and then we might take some close-up candid photos, and then we can talk to that person afterwards. Yeah, especially because those close-up candid photos are more likely that will be used in a published material later on.
Right, right. I just didn't know if kind of asking after the fact, if it's
If you
kind
have
of rude,
explained
but
before, I think if you have explained that general explanation with details of the purpose and how we might use, then you can ask those specific individuals, because those photos, again, those are the situations that require written consent, because the photos are gonna be used. Any other questions? Anybody wants to share from their experience in the field? Any difficulty they have found context-wise, cultural barriers in obtaining consent? And after this, I will share, when we share the recording for our colleagues that couldn't be here and the presentation, I will share the policy again in one package. Okay, if no questions, we'll finish early and give 15 minutes back to everybody's day. Especially thank you to the colleagues in India that I know it's quite late for you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Spratan.
Thank you very much, Thais.
Thank everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
thank
Thank,
you. Have a good
bye.
day,
Thank
all.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.